Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. It's great to see you all here in this beautifully cool room, away from the heat outside. But it's not only physical heat we've been dealing with recently. We have, in a European summer of elections that is not yet over, seen a surprising amount of, well, turmoil might be thought to be a pejorative or normative statement. Things that we hadn't necessarily expected happen in quite large measure. So we're extraordinarily lucky to have such a great group of people here today to guide us through thinking about all of that. We'll begin with our panellists, and to take us through the panel, we're very lucky to have Bill Emmott, himself an alum of Nuffield College, former editor of The Economist, who's going to be chairing the panel. Bill's recently published a book called The Fate of the West, so he clearly knows the answer. Bill.
Thank you, Andrew. I know all the questions. The questions are, why 8 weeks ago did we expect a particular outcome in the British election, and now we have the one we have. But we've got a splendid panel to go through what it is, why it is we're here for the third time in 3 years, which is a splendid but surprising fact in itself. So, to introduce the panel, from my right, Vernon Bogdanor, research professor at King's College, former professor of government at Oxford, and Nuffield College, 1964. Jane Green, professor of political science, University of Manchester, co-director with Jeff of the British Election Study, student at Nuffield, 2003. Jeff Evans, fellow of Nuffield and professor in the sociology of politics, Oxford, co-director of British Election Study and a student at Nuffield in 1983. On the far left, Felix Kravetsek, postdoctoral fellow at Nuffield, has also did his DPhil at Nuffield, and a former visiting fellow at the Centre for European Policy Studies. And we hope that this empty chair will soon be filled by Nathalie Nougared, former executive editor of Le Monde, now a columnist at The Guardian, who will enlighten us on France, and is probably stuck in some sort of fog in the Channel. We're going to open with 3 speakers on the UK, Jane, Jeff and Vernon, and then move to France and Germany. So Jane,
thank you.
Enlighten us.
Okay, I'll try to do that. So I've, for many years, been looking at the effects of shocks, political shocks, economic shocks, that really shape public opinion and also can determine the basis of elections. And what I want to reflect on is the shock of the EU referendum last year and what role it played in this general election that we have just had. One of the thoughts that we want to bring to the table is that the destabilisation of the electoral system or the party system is a very important feature into which shocks have important consequences. And so with partisan de-alignment, with a weakening of party attachments, we see increasing volatility in the electorate, so people being much more likely to switch their party choice between elections. And as we got to the 2015 election, that number of people in our data that had switched in the British Election Study was around 40%. So, broadly speaking, almost half, or nearing half, of the electorate is willing to switch its support between elections. And of course, into that environment, when you have large political shocks or large economic shocks or large shocks to the system, then our argument is that those effects can be particularly important, particularly impactful, and can be particularly destabilising. And so in a sense, what we're talking about then is a Brexit referendum happening within the context of an already quite destabilised political system. And so when thinking about the impact on Brexit on this election, I'll just rewind a few weeks and ask us to cast our minds back before we knew what the election outcome was, and think about what we thought was going to happen. So what we thought was going to happen was that the Leave vote and the UKIP vote would deliver a Conservative majority. Why was that going to happen? Well, if you looked at the swings that would be required from Labour to the Conservative Party, large swings, 6, 7, 8% swings, you could look across. I'm, of course, thinking across the ITV battleground, or top Conservative target list. I called it lots of different things. If you looked across that list, what you got was seats that really had been not won by the Conservatives either ever or since the heyday of Margaret Thatcher. And the reason those seats could have swung to the Tories delivering a Conservative majority was because UKIP had been achieving vote shares in the last election of 20, 22, 25, 28%. And of course, if the majority of that UKIP vote had gone to the Conservatives, that was sufficient in a number of cases to have had the potential to deliver a Conservative majority, and a very large one. And even Theresa May, just days before the election, was campaigning in some of those seats with those really large swings being required to win a Conservative majority. And so that was the expectation. The expectation was that that Leave vote had to go to the Tories. And of course, that wasn't entirely correct. The other expectation was that there was a sort of asymmetry in the degree to which the referendum was energising the electorate. And so the idea was that UKIP and Leave voters were very energised about the referendum and would reattach themselves to the party that was going to deliver the Britain's departure from the EU, and they was going to do so with a hard Brexit, and that somehow Remain voters had sort of accepted their fate and had not felt so mobilised, had not felt so energised and motivated by this very important event. And Chris Prosser, who's sitting right over there, sorry Chris, but Chris did some important work which showed that when you look at how people identified with political parties, of course we've seen that decline. Compare that with how people identified with either the Leave or the Remain side, you saw that people's EU identity, their Leave or Remain identity, was stronger than their party identity. But most importantly of all, Chris found that the Remain identity was as strong as the Leave identity. The Remain side felt as strongly about Remain as the Leave side felt as strongly about Leave. And so that suggested that there was this potential for the Remain vote to have an important effect on the election, but I don't think people expected it. And I think the reason they didn't expect it was because the anticipation was that the Lib Dems would be the party that should have captured that vote, and we didn't see the polls change for the Lib Dems, and therefore that was the story, that the Remain vote wasn't going to appear and that there was an acceptance of the referendum outcome. And then the third factor going into the election was that it wouldn't be possible for young people to turn out in particularly significantly higher numbers. And so there's a really important change that happened between 2015 and 2017, and it's really the largest now, so one of the most striking consequences or outcomes or features of the vote in terms of 2017 was that the age differential between the Conservative and Labour Party it widened substantially. So why did that happen? Well, on the one hand, you had the Conservatives scooping up UKIP voters who tended to be older on average. You had Labour scooping up Lib Dem and Green voters who tended to be younger on average, and this was widening the age gap. So that was I think that was the received wisdom or the expectation. And of course, what that meant was, if you thought that young people weren't going to vote, you thought that was going to be bad for Corbyn. And if you thought that older people were going to vote, you thought that was going to be good for the Tories. And of course, that age differential really accounts for why it was that there was this very large divergence in the opinion polls. So we found those pollsters who were essentially modelling expectations based on 2015 turnout were finding that Tories were going to do very well. Pollsters that were relying more on self-reported intentions to vote were finding young people saying they're very much more likely to vote, and those pollsters were finding a much more narrow either lead of the Conservative Party over Labour, or even YouGov predicting a hung parliament just before. And so, but there was this expectation that young people it wouldn't defy this kind of expectation of this linear trend. And so that's what we thought 3 weeks ago, and of course then we got the result, and we had to reflect on what had happened. And I think, what this has taught me yet again is that the overconfidence in thinking that some of the rules that we apply to political science, the rules that we apply to elections, need to perhaps be taken more lightly than we'd maybe held them before. So what did actually happen? So going back to those three things, well, first of all, of course, not all of the UKIP vote went to the Tories. Not all of the Leave vote went to the Tories, and the Labour Party did much better amongst Leave and UKIP voters than had been anticipated. That Labour success, really, with that core group had really meant that those expectations right across those larger swings weren't going to be seen, so it became very abundant that that wasn't going to be the case, that the really large swings from the UKIP to the Conservatives weren't going to be delivering those Tory wins in hard-to-win Labour areas. And we saw in the campaign that it really seemed that Labour had started doing better in the heartlands, in Labour heartlands in the northwest and the northeast amongst those UKIP voters. And UKIP voters had indeed shown, that they were, many of them had said they didn't know going into the election, and so that was a source of uncertainty. And also I think others have found subsequently that some of those don't knows were more Labour leaning, and so there was an evidence there that we might have perhaps expected it, but that Labour had done better amongst Leave and amongst UKIP voters, and that of course was one of the major reasons why the Tories didn't get the majority, at least on the basis of the they didn't get the majority, and also on the basis of the reasoning that it was expected that they would. The other factor, of course, was that Remain votes went more strongly to Labour, and that the absence, or the expected absence of the energising of that Remain vote, the absence of that didn't materialise, and what happened is that Labour did much better in areas that had voted more strongly to Remain. And, this was therefore evidence that Remain votes hadn't gone away, that it was an important factor in this election, and indeed that perhaps this would be, after all, something of a realigning election amongst the EU Brexit lines. Looking at turnout, of course, what happened was not just that young people became more likely to vote because Jeremy Corbyn was representing young people and had offered tuition fees, the cut in tuition fees, and that Jeremy Corbyn was the anti-establishment candidate that inspired the young. It was also, of course, the case that turnout was up in areas that had voted more strongly to Remain, and turnout was down in areas that had voted more strongly for Leave. And that was a really important factor. It's a really important factor, I think, in trying to assess exactly what's going on in this election, because what you've got there is the overlay or the combination of a Leave and a Remain vote, a young and an older vote, and of course, I'm looking at Jeff because I'm sure he'll talk about this, but this very interesting change in the class appeal of the two major parties. So the Tories doing better amongst working class voters, and the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn doing better amongst more affluent voters, more graduates, the young, and so on. And so, this is a very interesting relationship, and of course that the relationship, and this is at the aggregate level, so we have to wait for more data to dig down at the individual level, but that relationship between turnout being higher in Remain areas and lower in Leave areas, of course, is at the absolute flip of what happened in the EU referendum, where turnout was higher in Leave areas and turnout was lower in Remain areas. And so, there again, I think what's happened, and all of this is speculative at this stage, we've got to wait for lots more analysis, but, what it seems to me is that turnout and the relationship between votes for Remain and Leave and Labour and the Conservative very much looks like a Brexit referendum effect, both on votes for the two major parties, both on the increase in the two-party share, but also on the effect on turnout in 2017.
Okay, well, we ought to get Jeff to chip in.
Okay.
Jeff, a year ago, you blamed Tony Blair. Who do you blame this time?
Do I blame anyone? Yes, I do, I suppose. First of all, a lot of people have talked about populism as a way of characterising elections in current Western societies, and I think this was a populist election, but not in the normal way of populism. It wasn't so much the Front National that was the feature of this part of this competition, but the Podima or Syriza, the Southern European economic left parties. Because in the end, although obviously Jane said lots of stuff that we'd all discuss and agree on, this election was not about Brexit. It was supposed to be about Brexit. It was supposed to be a coronation. And there are certainly some results that can only be explained through Brexit, such as Kensington and Chelsea, for example, where the richest borough in the country went Labour for the first time ever, or Stoke South, which is where I'm from, of personal interest, a desperately poor place, always Labour, suddenly switched to Tories because the 8,000 UKIP voters had no one to vote for anymore because UKIP didn't run a candidate, so they decamped. I'll come back to that a little later. So you get specific examples, or university towns here and there, like Canterbury. But on the whole, this second dimension, as we academics would call it, this notion of instead of politics being about the classic issues it's been about in British politics, which is right versus left, redistribution, the slice of the cake. The new dimension of, say, ethnic exclusion or nationalism or whatever you want to call it, didn't have a big impact in terms of the outcome of this election. That's my contention. And how do I argue that? Right. First of all, let me just indulge myself by pointing out that Jeremy Corbyn achieved the most remarkable electoral result that any Labour leader has ever achieved in one respect. Unlike Tony Blair, who only managed a pitiful 8% increase on the 1992 situation for his party, from 35 to 43%, Jeremy Corbyn achieved a 10% growth, from 30 to 40%. I think the only person who's beaten that is Clement Attlee in 1945. That's pretty credible territory for somebody vilified by not merely the political press of most papers, but his entire party, apart from a handful of stalwarts. This is remarkable. It's unique. I mean, John Curtis said this the other week too. Nothing happens in campaigns. They're really a bit boring. Political scientists try and make them interesting. Politicians do too. But most of the time, pretty much at the start of the campaign is what you get at the end of it. There's some bit of movement up and down. But it doesn't change anything radically. This is vastly and uniquely different. What we see is basically, during this campaign, the Tories currently are kind of running around being really kind of harsh about the fact that their manifesto lost them the election, they believe. At least some of them do. I don't think that's true. I mean, I've looked at the data on that. If you look what happened with Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, they crossed out, well, they didn't cross over, but their direction of appeal to the population from the start of May, when we measured it every single day, was Corbyn was like that, and only a little bit flatter later. And Theresa May was like that, and actually flattened out around the time of the manifestos. The manifestos at that time, and the fallout afterwards, were their attempts at capping or whatever, didn't have as big an effect on Theresa May's fate as did Theresa May's performance in the weeks leading up to that manifesto, in terms of her inability to actually get out there and communicate with people in a humane and effective way. So different from Corbyn, who, just as his managers were saying and his colleagues are pointing out, if only you see Jeremy perform, you'll learn to like him. He's a good guy. And no one believed that, because the press had basically painted a picture of this hideous villain. And my only interpretation of that is from the start of the campaign, before the manifestos were leaked by Labour or just put out there, or ineptly by the Conservatives, Corbyn had done remarkable things in terms of improving his own appeal. With the manifestos itself, Theresa May was obviously going for a kill off the PLP strategy. She adopted an economic populism to some degree, and a nationalist populism very clearly. The Queen of Brexit, and also a person who actually used words like working class in her leadership speech when she took over. A person who actually introduced, some things that are reasonably redistributive. People vilified her, for example, for the social care proposal. Well, to be honest, my parents were delighted. I mean, they have about £100,000 in a house. They're untouched. If they die, I get all of it. I don't mind it either. But and lots of people have less than them. And so it was actually aimed at appealing to people who didn't have a lot of money. But it was also, obviously, they're supremely arrogant, because most of the hardcore Conservative supporters are older people with quite a lot of money. It was taking them for granted, as one or two of the other ideas. It reflected, basically, this is a foregone conclusion, I'm going to clean this up, and therefore I don't have to make the normal political machinations to appeal to my side, because basically they're in the bag. That was an error, should we say, but she'd already started to lose it on purely personal grounds before then. She wasn't very well suited to her role. She reminded me a little of a more extreme version of Gordon Brown, who, having taken over from the master of being the front man, Tony Blair, who I may not be a great fan of, but I have immense respect for his skill at what he did. found it very difficult being the front man rather than the backroom man and doing that stuff. And she's experienced that at least as heavily, if not more than he did, to be honest. So she basically drove her tanks onto the lawns with these relatively sort of centrist economic policies and an authoritarian, yes, Brexit, hard Brexit. And what happened? Well, Jeremy Corbyn, in a sense, retreated. He retreated to the left. And you wouldn't see it as a retreat, you'd just see his natural home territory, obviously. But basically, he moved sufficiently far to the left on various things that the Tories never got near him. And the things he moved to the left on were things that actually are not just appealing to the working class and others like that. They're like free university tuition, which appeals mainly to the middle class, because let's face it, you know, that's who dominates universities. So it was a giveaway manifesto with it was budgeted. Not everyone is convinced that places like the IFS that it is ruthlessly budgeted, but nonetheless, an effort was made, and it worked. One of the fascinating things we saw over the campaign over the period of May was that at the start of May, if you run a statistical model predicting vote intention and including things like your attitude to Brexit, your perception of Theresa May, your perception of Jeremy Corbyn, and your attitudes to redistribution and, say, the NHS like social service provision, we saw then was like, yeah, the massive lump of negativity from May, positivity from Corbyn, NHS, yes, Labour tend to have a lead in that. Redistribution, pretty small. And, you know, Brexit was there. It was significant. By the end of that period, it was redistribution that had grown enormously. This election had become changed from one focusing on Brexit to one focusing more upon inequality. Immigration didn't really feature, did it, this time? I mean, they mentioned Brexit, but the immigration thing, the thing that really drove Brexit, was dead because, well, it was effectively sorted. And the people who would have voted Labour, some of them voted Tory on that sort of basis. But it nullified the effect, to some degree, of that issue, and Labour were able to change it to a more traditional left-right redistributive dimension. Although most of the impact, even then, was not manifestos. It was these leaders, one doing a really good job of being humane, reflective, thoughtful, occasionally getting things wrong, and the other one doing a really good job of being, well, I don't want to go on about robotic, because everyone says that sort of thing, it's too easy, but not an effective people person, should we say. So, what do we have? In a sense, Corbyn's populism is an economic one, but not just the working class. And what we've seen is a continuation of a trend that we've seen before, where Labour are no longer the party of the working class. Even in 2015, John and I showed that UKIP were the party of the working class. Labour, you know, were competing with the Tories for them. So what we've seen now with some of the UKIPs going to the Tories is Labour is struggling. But because the Tories just generally did so bad, there is still a class dimension to British politics. And actually, John was wrong about this, John Curtis. He said in an article recently that it was dead. Not quite dead, although it's not as strong as education, which goes in the opposite direction. That's the more Brexity, free tuition type side of things. Higher educated people vote Labour. Lower educated people vote Tory. Working class people tend to vote Labour a bit more than Tory. It's a fascinating mix. And that's because there's not just a single dimension. There is this Brexit cross-cutting immigration thing. But in this election, it was the dog that didn't bark too loudly.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to